There's a common disclaimer in finance: past performance is no guarantee of future results. You'll usually find it buried in the fine print of an investment pitch, a legal shield for fund managers when things don't go according to plan. But if this disclaimer applied to nations, the United Kingdom would be the ultimate test case. For centuries, Britain didn't just punch above its weight, it defined the global weight class. As the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, the UK was once the workshop of the world, producing nearly one-third of all global manufactured goods. By 1870, a century ago, it sat at the heart of the largest empire in history, ruling over 26% of the Earth's land area and nearly a quarter of its population. To any observer in the 19th or early 20th century, Britain's prosperity seemed like a permanent law of nature. Yet today, in 2026, the narrative has shifted from global dominance to a productivity puzzle and a stagnation trap. The British disease is back, and this time it's been caused by a series of what we might call compounding errors. While the empire dissolved after 2 world wars, Britain remained an unusually successful nation for much of the late 20th century, seen as an economy that had firmly found its footing. But since the global financial crisis of 2008, that footing has slipped. While the United States has managed to pull away significantly since the crash, the UK has instead become a masterclass in self-inflicted stagnation. The data tells a stark story of divergence. Between 2008 and 2023, the US economy grew by a staggering 87%, while the EU managed just 13.5%. The United Kingdom saw a similarly sluggish 15.4% rise. During this same period, Japan has struggled with a shrinking workforce, and even China, the world's most reliable growth engine, has seen its momentum cool as it grapples with a massive real estate crisis and an aging population. Unfortunately, many of the UK's struggles feel self-inflicted. Over the last decade, we've seen a steady drumbeat of prime ministerial churn, policy reversals, and car production that's fallen to its lowest level. Since 1956, Britain is currently the only G7 nation where the quantity of goods exports is lower today than it was in 2016. The big problems are well known: stagnant growth, feeble productivity, some of the highest industrial energy prices in the world, and the lingering toxin of Brexit. These problems aren't just a matter of misfortune, they're the result of compounding errors, from an uncertain business environment to a tax system that punishes ambition. Let's dig into the data to see if the UK really is the sick man of the West, or if a bit of statistical pessimism is hiding a much healthier reality. First up, we need to talk about why the productivity puzzle everyone keeps mentioning isn't really a puzzle at all. If you spend enough time reading financial news, you'll run into the productivity puzzle. It's a term economists use to describe the stark slowdown in the amount of value the average British worker produces for every hour they work. Before the global financial crisis, the UK's productivity was on a solid trajectory, but since then it's hit a wall. Today, the average British worker is about 20% less productive than their counterpart in the United States. Economist Tess Perry argues that there's no puzzle here at all. He says we know exactly what the problem is. About a third of Britain's productivity slowdown is caused by a simple lack of capital per worker. In plain English, we haven't been buying enough of the tools, machines, and software needed to make workers efficient. British workers have to make do with a third less capital than their counterparts in higher productivity peer countries. Britain has spent decades underinvesting in everything from research and development to basic infrastructure. Perry pointed out in a recent FT article that every French city with a population greater than 150,000 people has a mass transit system in place. In Britain, there are 30 towns and cities that large that simply go without. When people can't get back and forth to work because the buses don't run, the effective size of our most productive cities shrinks. If you want to know where the remaining growth has gone, you have to look at things like the effects of Brexit on the business environment. And at red tape, Britain has created a planning system so complex that reopening a tiny 3.3-mile train line near Bristol required 79,187 pages of planning documents, generated over a 16-year period. All of this was done without any tracks being laid. Apparently, if you printed those documents out, the paperwork would stretch for 14.6 miles, which is nearly 5 times longer than the actual planned railway. We also need to look at the tax complexity, which created a world in which a doctor has to work a 61-hour week just to earn an extra pound, and we'll look at the Bermuda Triangle of talent that's sucking the ambition out of the UK's smartest graduates. A key factor that's killed productivity and economic growth in Britain has been the cliff edges built into the tax system. We often hear politicians talk about the importance of a nation's work ethic, but the UK has structured a tax system that actively discourages people from doing additional work. UK tax expert Dan Needle gives the example on his website of a consultant anesthesiologist who earns just under £100,000 a year, a typical salary for a junior consultant. Because this doctor has young children, he receives 15 hours of free childcare allowance from the government. Without the subsidy, this would cost him around £20,000 a year if he agrees to work extra hours to help clear a hospital backlog, and his income goes above that £100,000 mark. His marginal tax rate explodes to 62%. On top of that, his eligibility for free childcare vanishes. The math is so brutal that he would have to effectively work an extra 21 hours a week just to earn an additional pound of take-home pay. Unsurprisingly, many doctors and skilled professionals just choose to stay home. This chart from the FT shows how there's currently around 400,000 people in the UK bunching their earnings just below the 50,000 and 100,000 pound thresholds, specifically to avoid these tax traps, where higher income would translate to lower take-home pay. Dan Needle's website, Tax Policy. Associates gives a great breakdown of the tax mistakes that help to lower British productivity, while the tax system is pushing people out of the workforce. At the top, our post-Brexit migration policy has been reshuffling the deck at the bottom. Since the Brexit referendum, the mix of workers arriving in the UK has undergone a massive shift. We've replaced a flexible pool of EU migrants who could flow back and forth at will between the UK and their home countries in response to economic demand with a much more rigid system of less flexible workers. After the government dropped certain visa requirements in the wake of Brexit, the country experienced its largest and fastest expansion in low-skilled migration in history. Many of these new arrivals are on visas tied to specific, often lower-paid sectors like social care. This has created a labor market that's far less responsive to the economy's needs. The UK has chronic shortages in some sectors while being swamped with labor in others. This combination of a rigid workforce and a punitive tax code is hitting the next generation the hardest. There used to be the idea that a degree from a British university was a golden ticket to higher earnings, but now the graduate premium in the UK has collapsed. In 1999, graduates earned 80% more than non-graduates did. Today, that gap has shrunk to just 45%. This has happened right as the cost of education has rocketed. John Byrne Murdoch wrote a great piece on this last month. He points out that while there are more graduates today than in the 1990s, the problem of the declining wage premium isn't driven by there being too many graduates. As in the United States, where the percentage of university graduates is about the same as it is in the UK, the graduate earnings premium actually rose to 92% over the same period. And to make it worse, according to OECD data, British graduates are more skilled in terms of literacy, numeracy, and adaptive problem solving than their higher earning American counterparts. The problem is that the UK economy just isn't producing enough professional, highly paid roles suitable for a university graduate. John Byrne Murdoch shows that since the 1990s, the share of managerial and professional jobs in the United States economy rose from 28 to 39%. In Germany, they rose from 19 to 30%, and in the Netherlands from 34 to 45% since 2005. The UK, on the other hand, has seen just a 6 percentage point rise from 27 to 33% since 1991. In the same way that Greek and Italian graduates struggled in the 1990s and 2000s, British graduates are struggling today. The declining graduate earnings premium is more of a comment on the country's stagnant economy than its higher education system. The steady increase in minimum wage in the UK has squeezed the earnings premium from the lower end too. If you look at these two charts, you can see that British graduates earn way less than graduates do in other comparable countries, and that British workers with less than a high school education earn way more than similar workers in other comparable countries. By narrowing the gap between the floor and the ceiling, we've created an economy where the financial incentive to spend 3 years studying for a degree is slowly evaporating, while many suggest that the simple solution is to tax the rich. The data shows that the UK already leans on high earners more than most. Middle to high income households contribute an unusually large share of the UK's total tax take, while the average British worker pays relatively little by international standards. The tax burden in the UK rises more steeply with income than almost anywhere else. Specifically, the cliff edges mentioned earlier can lead to marginal tax rates exceeding 60%. For those earning between £100,000 and £125,000 as the personal allowance is withdrawn. When you combine those cliff edges with the withdrawal of benefits, the state is effectively testing the limits of how much it can squeeze its highest contributors before they simply leave. We're already seeing the results. Office for National Statistics data shows net emigration of British people has averaged about 100,000 annually since 2021. Other nations are now proactively competing to attract Britain's highest skilled and wealthiest individuals. This reached a somewhat comical peak in the news this week. As the war in the Middle East intensified, the government began coordinating evacuations for British citizens living in Dubai and the UAE, many of whom had moved there specifically to escape the UK's tax regime. Reports emerged that many of these expats were extremely hesitant to sign the evacuation paperwork for fear of being taxed in the UK. It's a revealing look at the current state of affairs when a worker views an Iranian missile and an HMRC self-assessment form as roughly equivalent threats to their well-being. While the tax system discourages doctors from picking up extra shifts, a more structural rot is taking hold at the other end of the age spectrum. A significant cohort of young Britons now finds the world of work entirely out of reach. In March 2026, official data shows that nearly 1 million young people in the UK are currently what the government describes as NEETs, which stands for neither in education, employment, nor training, youth unemployment. In the UK has climbed to 16.1%, surpassing the EU average for the first time since the turn of the millennium. The headline unemployment figure tells only half the story. Most of these young people, about 57%, are classed as economically inactive, meaning that they've stopped looking for work altogether. Most alarming of all is the fact that 60% of current NEETs have never had a job at any point in their lives, the highest figure since records began. We're witnessing the lost million, a generation of young people who seems to be falling through the cracks of the social and economic map before they have managed to set foot on it. It's hard to know how employable this group will ever be, even if the British economy picks up again. Economists often talk about the scarring effect of youth unemployment, where those who spend their early 20s outside the workforce often face permanently lower lifetime earnings and a much higher risk of welfare dependency as they age. By failing to integrate this million-strong cohort, the UK is essentially mothballing its own future potential. A major driver of this inactivity seems to be a youth mental health crisis, which seems to be particularly acute in the UK and is possibly driven by the slow economy. The share of 16 to 24-year-olds in the UK claiming a health problem that reduces their ability to carry out day-to-day activities has tripled, rising from 7% in 2008 to 21% today. While rates of reported mental distress amongst the youth are rising globally, few countries other than Britain have seen this translate into such a sustained rise in economic inactivity For those tempted to dismiss this as a simple quest for easy welfare money, that argument is undermined by the fact that 44% of economically inactive young people in the UK are not claiming any welfare benefits whatsoever. We seem to be seeing the result of specific compounding errors. First, the high UK minimum wage, which has priced inexperienced workers out of the market. In sectors like hospitality and retail, the traditional entry points for the young hiring has become prohibitively expensive for many small businesses. At the same time, the education to work pipeline has broken down. Worst of all, since the pandemic, chronic school absence in the UK has exploded. The number of pupils missing at least one day every 2 weeks has doubled, and 1 in every 25 pupils is now absent from school at least half of the time. This level of disengagement is extremely worrying. You can't analyze the British economy without addressing the housing market. For decades, the UK has essentially operated as a property market with a country attached, while the American public is famous for its engagement with the stock market. With the stock market, with approximately 62% of American adults owning shares, only about 26% of Britons have any exposure to the markets outside of their workplace pensions. Instead, the British have poured the vast majority of their collective wealth into real estate as an investment. Today, net property wealth accounts for about 40% of total household wealth in the UK, while financial investments make up just 14%. The country serves as a warning to other advanced economies of what happens when a nation overemphasizes real estate as its primary investment vehicle. The result is a stagnant, immobile economy by design. Governments are incentivized to choose policies that push house prices higher and higher, as no government would be re-elected if they presided over a property crash. Older generations sit on massive, untaxed capital gains in appreciated property, while the young can't afford to move to productive cities because they simply can't afford the entry fee. As of early 2026, UK housing affordability remains stretched, with average home prices in England sitting near 8 times median annual earnings, nearly double the historical average of the late 20th century. Despite recurring government promises to build 1.5 million new homes, the reality has been a lesson in the power of NIMBYism and planning red tape. Local consultations and environmental hurdles have turned simple bricklaying into decades-long legal battles. In London, the situation is particularly acute. House building has effectively collapsed, with new starts reaching their lowest level since the Second World War. When property is viewed as an investment asset that has to go up year after year in order to keep voters happy, you eventually reach a point where it's so unaffordable to the young that they're forced to move abroad, where the cost of living is more in line with their incomes. Compounding the cost of living is the cost of simply keeping the lights on. As economist Martin Wolf argues, the British government has turned the country into a global outlier on energy policy. While British policymakers might believe that they're setting a green example for the rest of the world, Wolf points out that the UK only accounts for less than 1% of global CO2 emissions. So even if they cut emissions to zero, it just wouldn't move the needle. By maintaining industrial electricity prices that are among the highest in the G7, often 50% higher than in Germany, and 4 times the cost in the United States. The UK is not saving the planet. Instead, it's mostly just exporting its emissions to the third world. The country shuts down domestic manufacturing only to buy finished goods back from nations with far laxer environmental standards. It's a hollow victory that looks good on a carbon spreadsheet, but erodes the industrial base and possibly has a much harsher environmental impact too. Other nations are watching this green leadership and possibly concluding that it's not worth the cost. Then there's the triple lock. Since 2011, this policy has guaranteed that the state pension rises by the highest of inflation average earnings, or 2.5%. For 15 years, successive leaders have ignored the looming fiscal cliff that this creates, fearing the political fallout from the country's most reliable voting bloc, like High House. Prices the triple lock functions as a massive transfer of wealth from the young to the old. Median wealth for pensioner couples now exceeds £600,000, while a single parent under 35 has a median net worth of less than £30,000. By prioritizing the silver vote over economic reality, the state is taxing the working age population to the hilt to support a demographic that is in many cases significantly wealthier than the people paying for it. The frustration for many observers is that easy wins are consistently ignored in favor of political safety. The government could have implemented permanent accelerated depreciation for technology investments to jumpstart productivity. It could have made a concerted effort to attract disenchanted researchers from the United States and elsewhere, a literal brain gain. Instead, the UK has sidestepped the difficult decisions like unpicking the triple lock or genuinely gutting the planning system and settled for a bunker economy, safe for those already inside, but disastrous for those on the outside looking in. When an economy stops growing, politics stops being about how do we get ahead and starts being about who's taking my slice of the pie. Britain has entered a zero-sum era where every gain for one group is perceived as a direct loss for another. This is most visible in the generational divide because the economic pie isn't getting any larger. The elderly protect their property values and pensions with a ferocity that effectively locks the young out of the future. As The Economist recently argued, Britain's stagnating economy has brought back a bitter form of class politics to the UK. The haves largely older asset. Rich homeowners prioritize the protection of asset values. Meanwhile, the have-nots, the young and the working class, find themselves priced out of housing and squeezed by the highest energy costs in the G7. Historically, Britain's working class tended to vote Labour, while middle and upper class voters supported the Tories. This dynamic broke down in the 2000s, particularly after the Brexit referendum, as cultural issues rose in salience, age, and education replaced class as the key demographic dividers. According to The Economist, Reform and the Green Party have made significant gains amongst voters who don't own their homes. The college-educated and female members of this group have moved towards eco-populism, so the Green Party, while working class and male renters in social housing have increasingly switched to nationalist populism. So Reform, these movements don't offer viable structural solutions to the productivity problem, but they do provide a powerful vent for national anger. Nigel Farage, the leader of the Reform Party, is perhaps the most visible face of this trend. While he frames himself as a champion of the squeezed middle, it's worth remembering that he was also the primary architect of Brexit, the very event that many economists point to as the single greatest self-inflicted wound to British growth in recent history. The data around the damage done by Brexit is hard to ignore. By March 2026, the Brexit dividend remains invisible. Instead, the country is left with an economy that's roughly 5 to 6% smaller than it would have been had it stayed in the EU. Economists have calculated that the business uncertainty surrounding the exit and the eventual friction it introduced to trade caused a significant dip in business activity that the UK has never truly recovered from. Since the 2016 vote, UK business investment has essentially flatlined while it had grown by nearly 30% in the 5 years prior. Furthermore, trade intensity, the total value of imports and exports as a share of GDP, is down by about 15%. It turns out that starting a fight with your most important trade partners is maybe not a winning strategy. This stagnation breeds a specific kind of pessimism, when hard work and education no longer feel like paths to a better life. The most ambitious individuals stop trying to fix the system from within. This is the ultimate compounding error. A country that makes it so difficult for its most productive citizens to thrive that they eventually decide to take their talents elsewhere. A recent YouGov survey showed that 79% of the British public think that the economy is unhealthy, and 3/4 believe that it will be even worse in a year. The British disease of the 2020s isn't a lack of ideas or a lack of skill. It's a policy-induced paralysis. The solution isn't a puzzle, it's a hard choice that politicians don't want to make. It involves unpicking the tax traps, gutting the planning system, and making the difficult decision to stop prioritizing the bunker economy over the next generation. Britain has spent over a decade proving how easy it is to dismantle a successful economy through a series of compounding errors. The question going forward is whether the country can finally find the courage to start putting it back together. If you found this video interesting, you should check out more content on economic decline and policy mistakes. Have a great day, and see you in the next video.